Hello and welcome to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their families. I'm your host, Mindy Felinton. I'm sure you know somebody who's gone through and survived the hospital. Well, imagine if that person who you know, or could be you yourself, had an added component like dementia. How much more difficult and challenging that might be. Well, my guest today is Terry Ullman, who's a licensed clinical social worker, and she's here to talk with us today about surviving hospitalization and having that added component of dealing with someone with dementia. Welcome, Terry, and thank you very much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Really enjoy being on the program. Thank you.
Good, good. So tell us what it is about the hospital environment that makes it much more challenging for people who have dementia.
Well, what we've always known is that people with dementia really function best in calm, simple, familiar environments. And if you think about the hospital setting, it's anything but that.
Yeah.
It's confusing, it's overstimulating, it's bright, it's noisy. There's all kinds of unfamiliar sounds and odors and sights. People running around with machines that are scary looking and unfamiliar and poking you with needles. And then, to top it all off, you come into the hospital and you're stripped of your clothes and you put on this gown that you never have seen or would wear and stuck in a bed with nothing to do. And it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying for somebody who doesn't have the ability to really process what that experience means, and particularly if somebody who doesn't know where they are or why they're there.
So what are some of the things that loved ones who are accompanying their family member or a friend who is suffering from dementia, what are some of the things that they should look to do or assist with to make that situation less frightening and harrowing, really, for that particular person?
Well, I always think of the role of the family member as being threefold. One is an informer, two is a supporter, and three is an advocate. So as an informer, just as you would if your loved one was going to any other setting, it's really helpful if you can let the staff know what they can expect from your loved one. You know, people with dementia have all different degrees of abilities. And so you're the one who knows best what they can and cannot do, what kinds of situations are going to be challenging for them. So tell them everything that you can think of, including how they even like to be addressed. Mm-hmm. Let them know what medications they're already taking and who the doctors are and who the point of contact is going to be for the family. As a support system, you might find that it helps for you to actually do some of the personal care while your loved one's in the hospital. For instance, a lot of people with dementia have difficulty with showering or shaving. That can be a really traumatic experience for them, but if they do it with somebody that they know, who knows best how to approach them, it might go a lot easier. Now, some staffs in hospitals may not want them to play that kind of role in the patient's care, but a lot of staff these days are more than happy to turn that over to the family member. And
I'm sure.
And then finally, as an advocate, you know, I think that we've all learned that we really have to be our own advocates with medical care. So really being educated about what's going on with your loved one. Your loved one's not going to be able to ask questions, and even if they do, they're probably not going to remember the answers. Mm-hmm. So to make sure that you're present when the doctors come, make sure you find out what the treatment plan is, make sure you know when they're going for medical tests, and really question and challenge every aspect of that care, not in an aggressive way, but just in an informed way, so you can help your loved one make decisions.
And of course, having the legal documents in order to be able to do that is helpful as well.
Absolutely. You know, we really encourage families as soon as you get the diagnosis, because you know that at some point you're going to be dealing with a person who may not be competent any longer to make decisions for themselves, to get a power of attorney in place, to get your advance directives, get your will, and have all those documents ready whenever you go to any of these kinds of settings, and particularly in the hospital. They need to know who has decision-making authority for them.
Right, because otherwise they may not even speak with them.
Exactly.
And what are some of the risks associated with the hospitalization?
Well, we've long known that people who are hospitalized with dementia have very poor outcomes after hospitalization. Last year, there was a study done that was reported in the June 2012 issue of the Annals of Internal Medicine. The study was of 771 people, all of whom had dementia, some of whom were hospitalized and some of whom were not. And what they looked at was, what are the risks for people who are hospitalized? What they found was pretty alarming. They found that people who had dementia who were hospitalized were at much greater risk for one, physical and cognitive decline, two, institutionalization, and third, and most alarming, was death. For people who were in the hospital with dementia who also developed a condition called delirium, those risks were even greater.
And tell me what that means.
What delirium? Yeah, delirium is kind of a confusing common term, though, for older adults. I mean, people who have dementia are 50% likely to develop this condition called delirium. Delirium basically refers to a rather abrupt change in people's functioning. And it's a global functioning. It's their cognitive functioning, but it can include things like how they feel, how they behave, how they think, how they remember, all the things that make up really who we are as a person. So to give it a better picture, my mother was in the hospital a couple months ago, and she had heart surgery. And while she was in the hospital, she had a roommate who slept the entire day. We never heard a word from her. This woman was probably in her 80s and was obviously very, very ill. Mm-hmm. But about 10 o'clock at night, this woman would start screaming. And screaming and crying, "They're killing me, I'm drowning, help me, I'm going to die." And it went on and on and on all night. And the staff kept coming in trying to calm her down and reassure her. And one of the things that happens with delirium is that even our level of consciousness is kind of impaired. People seem to be awake and alert, but they really aren't. And that was the same that was true with her. I mean, in a way, it seemed like she was dreaming, but in fact, she was sort of alert, but she was so out of her mind that she really couldn't be comforted in any way. In fact, she got very combative with the staff. And this is a pretty common occurrence in hospital settings, and it's very difficult to manage. And then what I've seen happen with my dementia clients is they get delirious. Then the hospital needs to get the behavior under control, so they start medicating. Mm-hmm. Then they have a reaction to the medication, and so it goes.
It just spirals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the delirium, is that something that's just particular to dementia patients, or is that something that's pervasive within the realm of hospitalization that you're aware of?
It's more common with people with dementia. I think it's about, and it's more common with older adults. So people who are just older adults without dementia will develop delirium about 10% of the time.
And what is it that, do you know what precipitates that, or was that part of the study?
Well, the delirium is always caused by an underlying condition. So, in fact, that's what treatment's all about. You have to try to figure out what the underlying condition was that brought it on. And it can be any number of things. It can be lack of oxygen. It can be chemical imbalances like the electrolytes getting out of whack. Mm-hmm. It can be from kidney failure or heart failure. It can be from stress. It can be from depression. So the first thing that we have to do is try to figure out what's causing the problem here. So they may run a number of tests trying to figure it out. They also want to get the patient as calm as possible. So calming down the person may mean quieting the room, lowering the lights, talking with them in a soothing way, helping to orient them to the environment that they're in. If it's successfully treated, then people with delirium, usually the delirium will clear up within a week, but sometimes it takes several weeks before people return to normal functioning.
I wonder, though, about the likelihood or the frequency of really delving deep into the cause. Mm-hmm. In my mind, I'm thinking that probably 90% of the time they just medicate.
Right.
Knowing that that's a common theme. It's just medicate to control the reactive behavior.
Right, because sometimes it's not clear. Now, if you think about the symptoms of delirium, they're very common to symptoms of dementia. So sometimes it's kind of hard to sort out. Is this person just getting more agitated because they're in the hospital environment, and in fact, this is just an exacerbation of their dementia, or is this, a delirium on top of the dementia? And getting back to the woman that I was telling you about in my mother's room, one of the things that I found really disturbing was sometimes the staff doesn't really understand what delirium is, or that, you know, the person really is kind of out of their mind. They're not really in control of what they're saying or doing. And at one point, one of the nurses started yelling at this woman, saying, "I refuse to have you speak to me that way." And I mean, the woman had absolutely no control and probably not even any awareness of what she was saying.
And one might think that working in a hospital setting that the staff would be more aware of the fact that these are behaviors that are certainly not the typical behavior. It's a medical-driven behavior.
Right.
So unfortunate.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. But you know, in defense of the medical staff, there's so many things they need to understand and be aware of. Think of all the thousands and thousands of conditions and illnesses that people have. I mean, I remember asking my niece who just graduated with her RN and said, "How much dementia training did you get to get your RN?" She had 1 hour. But if you think about all the things that she had to learn, I mean, you know, it's troubling to us knowing that those nurses are going to be caring for our loved ones with dementia in the hospital. 1 hour doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
But, you know, this is a problem that we're facing with the medical staff. So it's really important for families not to assume that the staff will know or have some education about this. They may or may not.
So I guess going back to what we originally were talking about, it's important for a loved one to talk with the staff and try to make it as clear as possible about what, you know, who they're dealing with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
To kind of put them on a different plane.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, it was interesting when I gave this talk a couple weeks ago at Arden Courts. The audience said, "Yeah, and it's not that you just say it once; you say it over and over and over again," which is true because, you know, the problem in the hospital is you have this change of shift. It doesn't always get into the records, and so, you know, it feels like you have to keep doing that. Well, to me, it's worthwhile. You know, it's unfortunate that you'd have to go through that experience. If you can, ask them to put it in the record, have it written out so that it is in the record. But if you have to say it to the charge nurse of every shift, well, you know what? Then you know that your loved one's going to be well taken care of.
So be it. Is there any other mechanism by which there could be that continuity without having to repeat it? Like, is there some, well, I know, like with the Alzheimer's Association, how they have I think the purple ribbons and things like that are they're colors, for example. So I wonder if there's some way, I'm trying to be creative here, to identify that this is someone who is dealing with a memory disorder.
Right.
So that the family member doesn't have to keep repeating it.
Well, I think you're absolutely onto something, and I think that's a really important thing that we should look toward doing in the future. Because when I talk to a lot of people about what's going on in the hospital and what do you think is going wrong, and this is both people that work in the hospital setting and people that work in the community and caregivers and professionals alike. And one of the things that everybody said kind of consistently was, you know, the difficulty is that when you come into the hospital, you're coming in for a primary condition that has nothing to do with dementia. So they may never even know that you have dementia, but obviously if you have dementia, that impacts every aspect of your medical care. So somehow to designate from the get-go, this is somebody who's coming in that's going to be compromised cognitively, that you're going to have to treat in a little bit different way would be very, very useful. Yeah, so I think you're right. If we could come up with something like that, would be very helpful.
Well, I'm going to work on that.
Okay, me too. Great idea.
Great minds think alike and put two heads together. We'll come up with a plan. There's got to be a solution.
There has to be.
So what I'd like to do is when we come back from our break, continue on and talking more about the hospitalization and even going back to your comment about the prevalency of death in dementia patients as well. So we're going to take a short break. And we'll be right back.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Welcome back to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their families. I'm your host, Mindy Felinton, and I'm joined today by Terry Ullman, who's a licensed clinical social worker. Welcome back, Terry.
Thank you.
And we were talking before the break about dementia and the hospitalization and surviving hospitalization and adding that extra component of going through that very difficult situation with a dementia patient.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it, or is there a greater frequency of dementia patients being hospitalized?
Well, one very interesting study was published last year in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It came out in January of 2012. This was a longitudinal study of 3,019 people that were living in the community at the time.
For the longitudinal meaning in that regard, what?
That they studied them over a period of several years. And they were actually looking at a lot of different things. But one of the things they were trying to understand is what, is the frequency of hospitalization for people. And what they found was that people with dementia are 50% more likely to be hospitalized than the general population.
And did they have a reasoning behind that, or come up with any conclusions about why that is?
Actually, in the study itself, they did speculate on a couple of different reasons why that might be happening. Now, one of the things that they said is that because of the brain disease, that people with dementia are actually more susceptible to getting acute illness than the general older adult population. So they are, in fact, sicker. The other thing that they said was that people with dementia, one of the things that brings about dementia is an underlying condition like stroke, which would lead to a hospitalization, or it can produce a secondary condition like pneumonia, which again would lead to a hospitalization. The other thing they talked about was the person with dementia themselves is not really that great because of problems with language to be able to communicate when they're in pain or discomfort, which would help people to understand about the onset of an illness prior to it becoming serious enough to be hospitalized.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also talked about the fact that many people with dementia are living in environments, whether it's at home or elsewhere, where they're really not able to get good medical care. A lot of people live in assisted living, for example. Assisted living is wonderful. I think it's a terrific option for people with dementia, but it is not a medical facility. There may be some nursing staff there that will help with monitoring some simple medical needs, but they're not there to really be proactive internal doctors. And so sometimes that information gets missed depending on the setting that they're in.
Mm-hmm. Well, what would you recommend? Do you have suggestions for people who have a loved one who has dementia to help to avoid the hospitalization?
I do. I actually really believe that we should try to prevent hospitalization as much as we can for people with dementia. I also believe that even if we can shorten the length of the hospital stay, that's going to make a huge difference, because one of the things the study is telling us is that it only takes about 2 days before we start to see a secondary physical or cognitive decline in people with dementia. Only 2 days. So families can do a lot of things, actually. One of the things they can do is talk to their doctors and say, the hospital is not a great environment for my loved one. Is there any way that they could be taken care of on an outpatient basis? Mm-hmm. Getting back to the study that was published in January 2012, one of the things that they found, interestingly enough, was that 2/3 of the time when somebody was hospitalized with dementia, they had a condition that could have potentially been treated on an outpatient basis. 2/3 of the time.
Wow, that's
a
huge ratio.
It's incredible. So, I think it's really important for families to recognize hospitalization is a choice. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go. So find out if it's really necessary. Find out if there's some way to do the medical care outside of it. Even if all you're doing is shortening the length of, the hospital stay by having them to do some tests someplace else and then going into the hospital for the procedure. So that's one thing that they can do. The other thing is that it's really difficult to provide personal care to people with dementia. Often they're very resistant. They don't understand why they need it. They fight families about showers and oral hygiene and all those things. But the hygiene is really important, and it can really cut down the amount of infection that people have. UTIs is one of the biggest reasons that people get admitted to a hospital. So to make sure that people are being clean and that they're drinking plenty of fluids is really going to make a big difference.
How do you suggest or recommend to people, family members, to help to deal with that situation, with the difficult family member who is resistant of drinking more water and or proper cleaning.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think what I always think about the fact that what a caregiver has to have what I call a toolbox. They have to have all these different strategies that they can pull out, and they try one and see if that works, and if that doesn't work, pull out another. Well, how do you fill that toolbox? I think you fill it by talking to other people who are in the same situation. So support groups can be a tremendous resource for people where they can learn other strategies, creative ways of trying to get their loved ones to do something who don't feel like they want to do it or need to do it. You can get a lot of information on the website, particularly from the Alzheimer's Association or Alzheimer's Disease Foundation. They have lots of detailed information about all these different types of problems. They can consult with someone like myself or with a geriatric care manager to get some education about it. And then there's all these free community education programs around specific topics. I know Arden Courts does a lot of that. So, you know, find out where those are and make yourself available. The more education you have, the better all of those things will go.
Yeah, great suggestions. And I know you also run support groups as well.
I do. I currently have a support group for people with mild cognitive impairment. This is for the person themselves. And it's a lovely group, and I really enjoy doing it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure it's very helpful for both the caregiver, even though they're not the participant, as well as the person who's suffering from the memory disorder. It's
such a challenging disease, and you know it makes us all feel so helpless because we really don't understand a lot about it. It's really hard for us to get inside the head of our loved ones and figure out how they're really experiencing the world and what it really feels like to be them. And you know, truth is, no matter what we do, they're going to get worse. So if there's anything at all that we can feel that we can be successful at, any step of the way, it just is so gratifying, and it just makes you feel so much better. So all these things help.
Yeah, well, that's great. I like the toolbox idea. Yeah. And any other suggestions that you have for family members to help give them some guidance to avoid having their loved one go into the hospital? And obviously, if at all, that they're out within 2 days.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think a lot of families have consulted me over the years about whether or not they even should pursue diagnostic testing. And one of the arguments they make is, you know, if I find out that they have this condition, am I really going to want to put them through
chemotherapy?
Chemotherapy, exactly. That's a very good example. The chemotherapy, could they tolerate it? What would that really do to the quality of their life? Are they really up to that? I mean, everything becomes challenging. Even going to the dentist can become challenging for people that don't understand what's going on and don't have the capacity to understand that. So, you know, to put our loved ones through these ordeals, I mean, a lot of people feel like, what's the point? And I can fully support that. So I think it's important for families to have those discussions, to figure out and figure out how far do I want to go with medical care? What do I really want to do for this person? What's our end game here? You know, do we want them to be as comfortable as possible, or do we really want to be very aggressive about everything that we do to treat them, and under what circumstances? Advanced directives can really help you think about that, but I think these discussions have to go on, and they have to go on periodically throughout the course of the disease, because the truth is you never really know until you get there how you're going to feel about it. And so you might change your mind later.
Right, right. Yes. Circumstances change as well, and the whole situation can change what one might think 3 years earlier. I know we had a guest on, Betty Struble, whose husband had Alzheimer's and subsequently died from it, but along the way he was also diagnosed with terminal illness, and the decision had to be to treat or not to treat, which she subsequently didn't do because of the quality of life. Assuming that we've taken all the steps to keep our loved one out of the hospital or try to make it as short as possible, what are some other things that you might suggest if they end up, if a family member or a loved one is in the hospital, to help make them feel more comfortable? What are some of the things you would recommend that family members and loved ones do?
So one of the things to think about is what comforts your loved one. You know, what makes things go well for them? When are they most calm? When do they seem most happy? And then do what you can to modify the hospital environment for them. So that may mean things like to me, something that's really scary in the hospital is when you hear this voice, like particularly if it's in the middle of the night and you don't see the person, you just hear this voice. Well, there's this voice coming over the intercom or the pager, and that goes on all night long because, the hospital is a 24/7 place.
Yeah.
It doesn't have regular business hours. So for somebody who is already having cognitive problems and they're lying in bed and they hear this, it would be terrifying for them. Can ask the staff if they could please turn off the intercom or the pager in your loved one's room.
Oh, you can do that.
You can certainly ask. I've had the misfortune of being in 3 different hospitals this year, twice with my parents and once with myself. And what's striking to me is how different each of these hospitals are running, and just the different procedures that they have. They're all hospitals, but they're all doing very different things in terms of patient care and comfort. But it never hurts to ask the question, and I know some hospitals understand that and would be willing to turn off the pager or the intercom. So that's one thing you can do. If there's any items from home that bring comfort to the person, whether it's a pitcher or a blanket or
a dog.
Yeah,
that would be me. Bring in the dogs.
To provide that in the hospital room, just to be reassuring. I think it helps to have things to distract them. One of the things that's so hard about being in the hospital is lying in that bed for hours and hours and hours, just worrying and anticipating what's going to come next. And for people with dementia, it's really hard to be immobilized like that. So finding things to entertain them, having crossword puzzles or games or something just to keep them distracted. People should really consider whether or not to have a TV or a phone in the room. For people with dementia, the television can be too stimulating. It can add too much noise. It can actually make them more agitated. So it might not be a good thing to have that on. So all those kinds of little comforts will make a big difference.
Yeah, those are all great things to know because I wouldn't have even thought about it. In my mind, I would have thought, the TV would be a great thing because it's something they're used to. Versus now I know to the contrary, more than likely.
Right, and I probably should make the caveat that every person with dementia is different. I've probably been doing this since 1986. I've been doing it for quite a few years now, and I have never met 2 people with dementia that look the same. So it's kind of hard to speak in any specifics about what works and what doesn't work. There might be some people who are actually comforted from TV, but that's where the care partner becomes so important because they would know that. They would know what's going to work well for their loved one.
Yeah, I guess it's just a general rule of thumb, and we're all unique, and as well at different stages of the dementia.
Exactly.
So while they might have been okay with the TV at one point, further down the road, it could be very disruptive.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I really think it was great to have the knowledge of the comfort factor, which we kind of started with when we first started chatting about the hospitalization and surviving it with that added dimension. So if someone wanted to get in touch with you and find out about working with you and get more information about the support group that you presently have, how would they get in touch with you, Terry?
I have a website. It's very simply just www.terryullman.com, or they can call me at 301-854-1121, and I'm very happy to be a resource. I really like working with this population, and as I said, I've been doing it for a number of years, not of different ways, and very happy to help any way I can.
Thank you. Thank you. And it comes through.
Thanks.
You're definitely, your passion for helping people with dementia comes through, and I found it to be very informative as far as knowing the different aspects of how we deal with surviving the hospital with an extra component. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And if you have any ideas for a topic or you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to contact me at seniorsolutionsTV@gmail.com. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.